Despite the fact that this was Patrick Wilson's first time in jail, he tried to look confident, hiding his fear from the other inmates. Carrying a shabby mattress and some of his personal belongings, the old man barely kept up with two hefty prison guards who accompanied him as they crossed the unlit prison hallways. Finally, one of the guards stopped at the cell door, fumbling with the lock. As the door opened, Mr. Wilson took a deep breath, as he would before jumping into the water, and timidly entered the dimly lit cell. Blindly squinting, the old man looked at the inmates and greeted them. "Good day." At first, all he heard was nothing but silence in return. Finally, one of the inmates answered in a displeased, drawn-out voice. "Well, it might be good for some, but it's not all that good for others, Pops." Hearing this response, Mr. Wilson instantly tensed up, expecting an imminent attack from the inmates. The old man knew that it would have been silly for him to expect a welcome party from the inmates in a state county jail. Once he got over his initial trepidation, Mr. Wilson unobtrusively asked the inmates where he could put his stuff. "It all depends on how you plan to live on, although it's pretty obvious. Just put your stuff on the bed over there," said one of the inmates, pointing to the bed next to the lantern. Mr. Wilson saw that there were other unoccupied beds in the cell, which were clearly more comfortable. "What, you don't like your bed, old man? What did you expect, a 5-star hotel?" said one of the inmates, who noticed the old man's hesitation. "No, I got nothing against it," Mr. Wilson mumbled. "That's more like it. Why don't you start with that? And now have some tea from this cup," an inmate sitting at the table told Mr. Wilson in a commanding voice. As Mr. Wilson approached the table, he looked warily at the cup filled to the brim with some fragrant liquid. "Are they going to poison me? Oh well, at least I go out with a bang," thought the old man as he raised the cup. Much to his surprise, the cup had a hole in the bottom. To prevent the tea from spilling, Mr. Wilson had to press his finger against the hole as he slowly drank the drink offered to him. Meanwhile, all the eyes were fixed on Mr. Wilson. Once the cup was empty, all the inmates got excited and started speaking at once. But the one who offered Mr. Wilson the cup of tea said, "Well, you've made your choice, Pops. Your place is next to the lantern." Mr. Wilson shrugged his shoulders indifferently and shuffled across the cell towards his bed. Eventually, the old man realized that the leaking cup was a test. The inmates believed that Mr. Wilson would refuse to drink from it, as it was made specifically for the lowest caste of prison inmates. "It's fine, I can take it. It's not like I was planning on becoming a gang leader, struggling to fall asleep on the hard prison bed." Since Mr. Wilson couldn't fall asleep despite his best efforts, his thoughts drifted back to the old days when he wasn't in prison, but lived in the heart of the wild forests that Oregon was famous for. At the start of his career, Patrick Wilson was a teacher. He had taught hundreds of students during his years of teaching. His wife Charlotte was always waiting for him at home. They spent 45 years together, full of love and mutual respect. Mr. Wilson didn't have children of his own, but helping raise his students was enough for him. Many of his students were very successful in life. Much to Mr. Wilson's disappointment, he had to quit his job when he started getting problems with health and eyesight. He bought a small house on the edge of the forest and moved there together with his wife. The fact was that Mr. Wilson loved animals and hated hunting more than anything else in the world. That's why he became a sort of ranger who tried to defend forest animals from poachers and hunters as best he could. Once, as he was patrolling the area, he witnessed 3 poachers shoot a moose long before the hunting season started. Such inhumanity infuriated Mr. Wilson. The man never owned a gun, so he grabbed a heavy stick and used it on the poachers, disarming them and taking them to the police station. And that's when it turned out that he was actually the guilty party in this case. The 3 poachers accused the 79-year-old man of causing them physical and moral damages. The poachers clearly had some influential friends in the town administration who had probably arranged for Mr. Wilson to be made a scapegoat and get arrested. As expected, the investigation didn't take long. Despite the fact that Mrs. Wilson hired a good lawyer for her husband, Mr. Wilson was still found guilty and sentenced to time in prison. Now, lying on the hard prison bed, the old man listened to the other inmates snoring and wept quietly. It was probably his nerves of the past couple of days giving way. "It's okay, I can take it." Charlotte promised to find a good lawyer. Maybe they'll be able to do something, Mr. Wilson thought as he desperately tried to fall asleep. Charlotte Wilson loved her husband so much, and when he went bald in his twilight years, she bought him a wig. But now that he was sharing his cell with actual convicted felons, Mr. Wilson realized that he didn't need the wig anymore. Thus, when Mr. Wilson noticed that his wig got detached from his head, and having no special glue in the prison, Mr. Wilson simply took it off and stuffed it under the mattress. Unfortunately, Mr. Wilson didn't manage to fall asleep that night, so he was very tired and felt broken the next morning. Meanwhile, the inmates didn't even notice that the new inmate suddenly lost all his hair in one night. But when Mr. Wilson approached the sink to wash his face, one of the inmates said, "Well, hello, Mr. Wilson. State County Jail is the last place where I'd expect to see you." The old man looked back in surprise and saw Raymond Summers, who was his student a long time ago. "Yes, Raymond. You see, strange things can happen in life," said Mr. Wilson sadly and shuffled towards his bed, which was meant for the lowest category of inmates. But Raymond didn't let his former teacher do that, as he already realized that it was a mistake and that Mr. Wilson shouldn't become an outcast. Raymond was a career criminal, and he knew that Mr. Wilson must have stepped on someone's toes, hence the humiliating punishment. Such arrangements would usually be organized with the help of the warden and some of the inmates, who would do anything to shave time off their sentences. A long time ago, when Mr. Wilson was Raymond's teacher, he used to help him out since he was an outcast because his family was very poor. And now, fate brought Raymond and his former teacher to one prison cell. Raymond wanted to pay Mr. Wilson back for his kindness, so he took the man under his protection, thus infuriating the warden. Fortunately, Mrs. Wilson didn't waste any time and did find a good lawyer who successfully filed for an appeal. Thus, the case of police misconduct against Mr. Wilson caused a stir in the public, which eventually got the true culprits of this case punished. After having spent nearly 2 weeks in jail, Patrick Wilson was free. His beloved wife Charlotte was eagerly waiting for him at home. "Thank you, Raymond. You were always a good guy. My advice to you is to put your criminal past behind you and start clean," said Mr. Wilson as he hugged Raymond for a final goodbye. The police and the warden apologized to the elderly inmate, and Patrick Wilson went back to being the protector of the forest animals. Although now, Mr. Wilson became more reserved in his methods and always relied on law when protecting the forest and the environment. 2 years had passed. One day, someone knocked on the old man's door. Wondering who it could be, Mr. Wilson opened the door and was surprised to see Raymond Summers. "I've decided to pay you a visit. Also, I've come here to change my life. It's only too bad that I've got no money or job, but it's okay, as long as I keep faith, so to say," murmured Mr. Wilson's former student shyly. Mr. Wilson smiled happily and hugged Raymond, continuing to listen to his story. "Don't worry, it's never too late to start anew. I'll help you with the job. Our local forestry needs a reliable worker. And it will make me incredibly happy to know that my former student is protecting animals instead of being a criminal," added Mr. Wilson as he invited Raymond to come inside. There, Mr. Wilson and his former student had some tea and some apple pie, as they recalled countless funny and sometimes a bit embarrassing stories from their school past. Several years later, Raymond Summers met his better half, who helped him regain faith in everything good and wholesome. It's hard to say what would have happened to this man if he hadn't met his old teacher in jail. But as we all know, things happen for a reason. And so the encounter between Raymond and Mr. Wilson must have been arranged by fate itself.